What's up guys, I'm Morley from YellRom Blog, and today I'm going to show you how I made this fully adjustable concrete and wood mic stand for my blue snowball microphone. The blue snowball is fantastic for its price, but it comes with this little stand that puts the mic at a really awkward height. To get the mic up to the level of my mouth, I have to sit at the coffee table or prop it up on a stack of books. Not an ideal position for long voiceover recording sessions. Before diving into the project, I needed a way to attach the microphone to the stand. The snowball mounts with standard 5/8 thread, and I found a perfect ball head on Amazon with male 5/8 thread on one side and female 1/4-20 thread on the other. I've had my fair share of recordings ruined by overexcited plosives, so I also picked up a pop filter to add to the mic stand. I'll have Amazon links to both of these in the description. I had this idea for a floor-standing A-frame with a long counterweighted boom arm. With the A-frame on a wheeled base and the boom arm able to pivot from just off the ground to 6 feet in the air, this design gives me a ton of flexibility to record anywhere in my apartment. But in order for this all to work properly, I had to do a little math. Sorry, Keith Decent. Basically, I wanted the boom arm to be perfectly balanced. I forced the counterweight side of the arm to be 1 foot long and made the mic side of the boom arm long enough that I could comfortably swing it over the side of a table. I weighed all of the components that would go on the boom arm: the mic, the ball head, the pop filter, and the 1x2 boom arm itself. So when I balanced the boom arm, the only unknown is the necessary weight of the counterweight to balance everything around the pivot point. I knew the counterweight would be a cube of concrete, so I could divide the mass by the density to find the volume of the cube and its dimensions. After all that work, I calculated that I needed a 4-inch cube of concrete, which, coincidentally, is exactly what I assumed. Alright, enough math, let's get to building. The base of the mic stand is basically a 1 square foot ice cream sandwich with a concrete filling. The cookie part of the sandwich is made of 1/2-inch plywood, which I'm laying out here. I cut the pieces out with my circular saw and used the masking tape trick to try and minimize tear out. Who needs a shop when you have your girlfriend's parents' snowy back deck? Next, I cut out strips of 3/4-inch melamine to use for the concrete molds. With the circular saw work done, I headed back to my warm apartment to build the base. I used one of the plywood squares as the bottom of the concrete mold since I wanted the bottom of the base to be attached to the concrete. I hot glued strips of melamine around this piece of plywood to form the sides of the mold. I sealed the edges of the mold from the inside with clear silicone and used my finger to smooth it into a radius. The clear silicone is really hard to see against the white melamine, but a flashlight comes in handy to check your work and make sure you didn't miss any spots. Once the silicone was dry, I drilled holes for the 4 bolts that go through the base. I used a 7/8-inch spade bit to countersink these holes from the bottom of the base, allowing the bolt heads to lie flush with the bottom. Then, I hot glued the bolts into these holes. This hot glue doesn't add any strength, but is there to hold the bolts in position while I pour the concrete around them and prevent water from leaking out of the holes during casting. You could also use fully threaded bolts with nuts to hold the bolts in position, but the bolts that I have only have threads at the end of their shaft. I used plenty of hot glue to really make sure that the concrete wouldn't bang the bolts out of plumb. I added some screws through the bottom of the plywood to give the concrete some more surface area to grab onto. In engineering terms, these are basically shear studs. Next, I moved on to making the mold for the counterweight. For the bottom of the mold, I marked out a 4-inch square on a piece of melamine and cut this out with my jigsaw. The pieces for the sides of the mold can really be any length. I just made sure they had plenty of height to hold 4 inches of concrete. I hot glued the mold together just as I did for the base. I also added some extra hot glue to the outer seams of this mold to provide a bit more strength. Then, I sealed the inner seams with the clear silicone. I have a few of these pieces of threaded rod, which are kind of perfect for attaching the boom arm to the counterweight. I took one, threaded on a handful of nuts, and hot glued the nuts together to make a janky threaded insert that I could cast into the concrete counterweight. Like before, the purpose of the hot glue isn't to provide any strength, but just hold the nuts together so that their threads line up while the concrete is poured around them. I made sure to cap the end to keep the wet concrete out of my DIY threaded insert. I needed a way to keep the threaded insert centered in the counterweight mold during casting and curing. So, I made a little sling by stringing rubber bands between nails in the corners of the mold. Before casting, I also taped over the threads of the bolts that go through the base. This gave me a reference for the concrete depth and kept concrete off the threads. After all that prep, I was finally ready for concrete. I used Sackcrete PSI 6000, which is the high-strength fiber-reinforced concrete mix available at my local Home Depot. I added a little water at a time to get a workable mix, being careful not to add too much. Next time I do a concrete project, I'm definitely going to mix the concrete in a big shallow tray rather than a Home Depot bucket. It's really hard to get the concrete evenly mixed in a bucket, especially when you're working with a pretty dry mix. I probably could have gotten away with adding more water, but it's hard to keep your civil engineering clout when you make watery concrete. I tapped the mold with a 2x4 and rotted the concrete with a piece of scrap wood to consolidate it into place. I also ran my jigsaw along the sides of the mold to vibrate out any air bubbles. Then, I filled up the counterweight mold. Just as before, I rotted the concrete, tapped the mold, and ran my jigsaw around the sides. Once I was satisfied with the concrete, I carefully pushed in the threaded insert. I gently tapped the sides of the mold to temporarily liquefy the concrete and wiggle the insert into position. Then, I secured it in place with the rubber band sling, making sure the threaded rod stayed vertical. I covered the concrete and left it to cure for 2 days. So, I wasn't very happy with how this concrete turned out. You'll be able to see that it didn't consolidate evenly, leaving pretty good sized gaps, especially towards the bottom. I probably didn't rod deeply enough into the concrete, and I think I was so stingy about adding water that I kind of shot myself in the foot. When you have such a dry mix, it's really difficult to work all the air out of the concrete. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter, because the pieces work and their function is just to be heavy. And on the bright side, I think the uneven concrete looks kind of cool. Once the concrete was dry, I unscrewed the threaded rod from the counterweight. Now, I was ready to embed the threaded rod in the end of the 1x2 boom arm. I don't exactly have a traditional workshop, or a vise for that matter, but you can jig up a surprising amount with just a desk and some clamps. I found the center of the 1x2 and drilled a hole half the length of the threaded rod. I used 5-minute epoxy to embed half the length of the threaded rod into the end of the 1x2. I'm gonna be honest, I was pretty nervous about the strength of this joint, so I gave the epoxy its full curing time of 24 hours. If you ask me, 5-minute epoxy is a pretty misleading name. When I threaded the boom arm onto the counterweight, I was half expecting the 1x2 to crack once I lifted everything up. But this joint came out super solid. There was no creaking, and on its own, the boom arm makes a pretty good Thor hammer. Next, I needed a way to attach the ball head to the boom arm. I rooted through my hardware collection and found a 1/4 bolt that was long enough. I used my keyhole saw to cut off the head, which gave me a little threaded rod that I could embed in the boom arm. Drilling into the mic end of the boom arm was much simpler than the counterweight end, since this time I could just put the counterweight on the floor to hold the boom arm vertical. I drilled a hole through the center and embedded the 1/4-inch threaded rod halfway in with epoxy. While the epoxy was curing, I continued working on the base of the mic stand. I started by attaching 1¼ casters to the bottom with some really short screws. The first time I installed the casters, the screw head stuck out too much and interfered with the wheels swiveling properly. So I removed the casters and added a countersink to their mounting holes with the tip of a drill bit. Next, I was ready to attach the top of the base. To figure out the hole locations, I put a little dab of paint on the tip of each bolt head, lined up the plywood square over the base, and touched it to the tips of the bolts. In hindsight, this probably wasn't worth the trouble, but I wanted to account for the possibility that the bolts got moved around a little when I poured the concrete. Getting the bolts through each hole ended up being a pretty slow, iterative process. I should have just used a bigger drill bit since these holes don't need to be tight. Once I finally got the holes aligned with the bolts, I used that 7/8" spade bit to countersink the holes, giving room for a washer and a nut. With the top of the base on, I finally had that delicious ice cream sandwich and was ready to work on the A-frame. I drew the 1x2 A-frame in AutoCAD and extracted each piece to get its dimensions. With weird angles like these, it's a lot easier to be accurate with lengths than angles, so I marked out each piece using all 4 side lengths. I used my jigsaw to cut out the pieces for the A-frame. With my limited space and apartment setting, the jigsaw is really the perfect tool for this job. As long as you go slow, you can get a really clean straight line, and it doesn't make much more noise than a blender. It's also pretty perfect for janky cutting setups like this one. Now, I was ready for the glue up. I designed the A-frame so that the long pieces slot into the base and the horizontal pieces sit on top of the base. I used a plywood spacer against a level to keep the horizontal piece in the right position during the glue up. The angled offcuts came in super handy to create solid perpendicular clamping surfaces. With one A-frame done, I glued up the second one in the same way. Now I was ready to attach the A-frame to the base. I removed the top plate from the base and marked out where I needed to cut slots to accept the feet of the A-frame. I drilled some starter holes and cut out the slots with my jigsaw. These slots hold the A-frames 3/4 inch apart, just enough space for the 1x2 boom arm. While the slots hold the A-frames in the right position, they don't provide any stability. So, I cut some 1x2s with my Japanese pole saw to build up the base around the A-frames. I glued these pieces to the base, tight up against the A-frames. I didn't have room to clamp all 3 pieces at once, so I glued the 2 outer pieces first and then the inner piece by itself. You might be asking yourself, hey Morley or Mr. Yellron blog, why didn't you just glue the A-frames to these 1x2 pieces or to the base itself? Well, the answer, my dear friend, is that the day this mic stand leaves my apartment, I want to be able to take it apart before I move it. So even though the A-frames were stuck to the base from the glue squeeze out, I still hammered them free before reattaching them. I reattached the top plate to the base and slid the A-frames into their slots. I drilled some countersunk holes through the 1x2 supports and screwed the A-frames into place from both sides. Finally, I was ready to add the mic components to the boom arm. With everything on the boom arm, I wanted to check if the actual balance point matched what I calculated at the beginning of the video. It was really satisfying to see that the actual balance point was within half an inch of what I calculated. And with that, all that was left to do, minus sanding of course, was drill a hole through the balance point and bolt the boom arm to the A-frames. It was really exciting to see this work for the first time, and I think Eden's reaction sums it up best. I'll stop talking for a minute and let her take over.
This is so cool watching this come together. It's like a live maker video in my apartment.
Check it out.
Like, how would you have it if you were standing?
Have it up here.
Yeah. Whoa!
So I designed it so that it could range of motion from standing to sitting on the ground.
Wait, put it all the way up, like as high as it goes.
That high.
Wow, and it just holds itself like that?
Well, I'm gonna add pins, but there's enough friction and it's balanced correctly that it's just holding itself.
Wow! Whoa!
Yeah.
So I could do like, hi, I'm showing you how to do a side bend.
Yeah.
So be like, I'm showing you how to do a triangle pose. I'm still talking into the mic.
Yeah.
Wow.
As you heard me say to Eden, my original plan was to use pins to lock the boom arm at specified heights. But since the arm is balanced and the A-frames provide a bit of friction, the mic just stays at whatever height you put it at. It's funny, this makes perfect sense, but never crossed my mind during the build. Anyways, I am amped that this turned out more user-friendly than I planned. I took the mic stand for a spin around my apartment, and I can confirm that this bad boy allows me to record just about anywhere. I'm really happy I gave the boom arm such a wide range of motion. It's really nice to be able to swing the mic up overhead if I need to work on something else. And if I'm ever feeling nostalgic, I can still record while sitting at the coffee table. Thank you for watching, and be sure to check out the rest of my channel. I have videos about making all sorts of stuff. If you'd like to directly support my work, check out the links in the description. And as always, have a great day.